Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for one of the last panel sessions of NPS this year. I appreciate all of you who have stuck around to hear what we have to say. My name is Shelby Oakley, and I am a director in GAO's Contracting and National Security Acquisitions team. And like I said, I'm honored to chair this panel today, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation with my GAO colleagues. This panel is really focused on talking about speed, specifically why the Department of War struggles to deliver warfighting capabilities at the pace that modern threats demand and what it's going to take to change that. The defense acquisition system was built for a different era. It was designed around linear processes, sequential milestones, and the assumptions that requirements could be fully defined before you even knew anything, before development began. That model made sense when technology cycles were measured in decades. It doesn't make so much sense today. Our work has continuously shown that leading innovative companies don't work that way. They iterate, they test early and often, and engage the customer as a key aspect of this process of discovery. They make and evaluate investment decisions continuously based on what they're learning, not based on a solidified business case written years before a product ships. And they ensure they're developing technologies continuously to upgrade their products based upon customer feedback, what their customers want. The question before the Department of War isn't whether to change. That debate seems to be largely settled. The acquisition transformation strategy makes it clear that the priority is timely and urgent delivery of operational capabilities to the warfighter and continuous adaptation and improvement on those capabilities. The question is, and it's the million-dollar question, how to reform at scale. How do we make agile and iterative practices that underpin speed the default, not the exception? That's exactly what today's panel addresses. 3 of my colleagues from GAO will present our findings from recent assessments that together offer a clear-eyed baseline of where the department stands and where it needs to go. I'm sure you will take notice that many of the things they discuss have been discussed by our keynote speakers this week and have been the topic of several panel discussions. I think you will also see that our findings and recommendations are well aligned with where the department needs to go. First, Brenna Derritt will share findings from our recent work on leading commercial practices that allow innovative organizations to prioritize investments and deliver value quickly. This includes her work on how agile portfolio management and iterative business cases help innovative organizations ensure they are investing in the right priorities over time to meet customer needs. This work builds off our prior work on iterative product development practices that these companies follow and how we see those practices showing up or not in weapons acquisition. The central message from this analysis being that newer acquisition efforts must be structured from their earliest stages to adopt these practices. Leadership decisions made at program inception will determine whether we succeed or repeat the same patterns. Then we'll hear from Brian Smith, who will address technology investment oversight, specifically the role of the Office of the Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering in aligning military department strategies across critical technology areas to ensure technology is available to meet current and future needs of our military and support agile portfolio management and iterative product development. Effective oversight of that investment portfolio really isn't a back office function. It's a strategic lever that the Department of War has. Third, Chris Durbin will examine weapons system testing, specifically whether departments' testing policies have kept pace with iterative product development practices like digital twins and continuous user feedback. Updating those policies isn't just a procedural matter, it's a prerequisite for guiding modernization. Taken together, these 3 presentations make the case that transforming how the department acquires and delivers capability requires action on multiple fronts simultaneously, not the least of which policy, process, and portfolio management. I'll ask each presenter to keep their remarks to approximately 15 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to questions. So get those questions ready to send in. Please join me in welcoming Brenna Derritt, who will share findings on how Agile portfolio management and iterative business cases are driving innovative product development and what the department must do to adopt these practices from the very start of a program. Brenna?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Shelby, and welcome again, everyone. I'm Brenna Derritt, an Assistant Director in GAO's Contracting and National Security Acquisitions team. For the past several years, I've been working primarily on that body of work that Shelby referred to on commercial leading practices that can help improve outcomes for government acquisitions, like weapon systems. And so today I'll be talking about our most recent report, which is the third in a series so far that we issued this past fall on leading practices in portfolio management and business case development. Please go to the next slide. So here's a quick summary of our scope and methodology. We examined 2 research questions to understand how selected companies employ portfolio management practices and develop business cases to guide their product development investments. We followed the same fundamental methodology as the prior 2 reports, which included a fairly detailed selection process to ultimately identify 8 leading companies. And this was based on awards for excellence and innovation, records of financial stability, and a history of successfully developing portfolios of cyber physical products. And then we interviewed relevant representatives, synthesized each company's information into summaries, and analyzed practices across the companies. Next slide. So I mentioned that this is the third in a series of reports. Several years ago, we started looking to update our longstanding criteria for assessing weapon systems acquisitions, recognizing that much had changed since we initially went out to commercial companies in the early 2000s. For example, threat environments have evolved, technology has advanced, and there's been a shift towards cyber physical systems in which software is driving the functionality of hardware. In our assessment of leading companies' practices, we found that they prioritize schedule with a heavy focus on delivering innovative capabilities with speed, which is a theme I think we've been hearing throughout this symposium. Specifically, they use iterative development cycles to quickly deliver a minimum viable product, which is one that provides the minimum capabilities needed for customers to recognize value. So these cycles include 3 main stages, as you'll see. The design, modeling, and simulation cycle entails fast, iterative design cycles using models that are based on high-quality data from physical engineering and that capture user and stakeholder input. These design cycles result in requirements that have been refined with users to meet the most essential needs. So in other words, they're ensuring that the right requirements are reflected in the MVP design. The next cycle reflects validation of that MVP design through testing of a system-level, fully integrated prototype with users. The prototype incorporates all hardware and software components to test the integrated functionality in the operating environment. And it may be a combination of physical and digital prototypes, or entirely digital in the form of a digital twin that virtually represents the physical product. At the end of the validation cycle, the product team has an MVP that has been proven to work as expected and meets user needs. And then into the production and delivery cycle, we found that leading companies only commit to production after they have validated the MVP design with users. Once that's done, they stop designing the MVP hardware and prepare parts for production, recognizing that they can still add functionality through software updates pre and post delivery of the system. We also found that in a single product development effort, leading companies may repeat these cycles and move in between them. For example, product teams engage in multiple design cycles as they repeatedly update the design and test it with users to refine the MVP's requirements. And once they move into validation, product teams may come across issues that require going back to design modeling and simulation to improve the design based on the test results and evolving user needs. And then after delivery, leading companies collect user feedback on the product and use it to inform upgrades and improvements for subsequent iterations, which can lead them back to the start of a new round of design modeling and simulation. So that's why you'll see those arrows kind of redirecting through the cycle. And just to note, this might be obvious, but this approach is considerably different from the traditional linear approach that we've historically seen in many acquisition programs, with long development cycles that seek to meet requirements that are prescribed before development begins. Next slide, please. So for the third report that we just issued in September, we were looking to identify the business processes that leading companies use to enable that technical iterative development process I just described. So here we found that leading companies employ equally robust processes to initiate, justify, and prioritize their product investments, both leading up to the start of and throughout product development. At the portfolio level, which is where the overall mix of products is managed, leading companies use a forward-looking Agile management process, and this entails continuously evaluating product development investments through a few recurring practices that you see here on the screen. The first is analyzing market opportunities and technology trends to determine target commercial and technological areas for the longer-term outlook. As part of this process, leading companies ensure the target areas align with their strategic visions, and they update their business strategies to address the target areas. They also identify the broad capabilities that will be provided through product portfolios. This includes determining the types of technologies users will need and asking questions like, what are the technological trends and what technology developments should we invest in? And they do this at least annually. The next process is assessing their portfolios for alignment between portfolio goals and business strategies and ensuring an appropriate mix of risk within their portfolios. This process includes developing plans for addressing gaps between strategies and intended products and identifying the technologies that will help deliver critical capabilities. So essentially looking at what is coming down the technology pipeline that can help meet the needs of the portfolio. And then finally, they prioritize their investments and allocate funds within the portfolios. They allocate funding first to the top priority products in the portfolio, and this depends on factors like budget allocation, development milestone approvals, and whether continued investment is warranted. Also, leading companies defer lower priority products. So for example, if there aren't sufficient resources available and capabilities the product is expected to provide could be delivered by other products in the portfolio. To make these decisions, portfolio managers leverage current information from business cases for individual efforts that make up the portfolio. And the portfolio managers are responsible for determining how proposed business cases will fulfill the capability needs of the portfolio. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the portfolio level. At the individual product development level, we found that leading companies also implement an iterative approach to building their business cases. So they ensure that each business case addresses 4 key elements, many of which will sound very familiar to you. These include market and user needs, which captures a problem statement or the high-level needs to be addressed by the product. It's more like a statement of objectives rather than prescriptive and detailed technical requirements. And this element also identifies the market and the users that the product will serve. The product definition element defines the high-level capabilities the product will provide, the basic technical functions and features, and the key technologies that it will include. And key to this are technology readiness assessments. We found that leading companies include only those technologies that will be mature by the time product development begins. And this element also captures information about supply chain risk and regulatory requirements or industry standards. The internal value element includes information on how the product fits with the strategic vision and portfolio goals, its benefit and opportunity costs, meaning the value of adding the product to the portfolio versus the cost of developing it instead of another product. Financial metrics such as estimated costs, target revenues, and return on investment, commercial feasibility, so answering questions like, do we have the competitive advantage in the market? And organizational readiness, answering questions like, do we have the available resources and skill sets to develop the product? And then target schedule is another element, and this includes the best estimate of the expected delivery dates and schedule margin, which is informed by user need, the planned product features, and the estimated time and effort required to progress through the development cycle. A couple of other important features of business cases to note are one, that they're realistic. So they clearly identify execution risks, uncertainties, and assumptions, and they include input from cross-functional representatives to inform those assessments. And they also are not static. As you'll see here, there's a distinction between the initial business case and updated iterations. We found that leading companies revisit the business case elements frequently to inform recurring decisions on investments. And that's what we'll discuss on the next slide, please. Leading companies expect that the underlying business case data will change as development progresses. So they continuously review and update the business case. They do this at least every 6 months, sometimes more frequently. They do this to capture knowledge gains from the product development progress, to provide portfolio managers with up-to-date information that could affect other products in the portfolio, and to ensure that the business case remains valid and viable. Some examples of elements that are updated include translating the high-level capability needs into specific technical features and functions that the product will include, and refining cost and schedule estimates based on market changes, progress of related or dependent development efforts in the portfolio, and evolving knowledge of what the development effort will require. So this iterative approach enables leading companies to mitigate uncertainty, right? They scale investments while they build confidence that the product can meet user needs and be delivered on time. Instead of fully funding the complete development effort before it begins, they allocate enough funding to start development and then make informed decisions about whether additional funding is warranted as product development progresses. This approach also minimizes instances of failing slow. So they don't spend significant time or resources on an effort that never gets delivered. And instead, it facilitates failing fast, which you've probably heard mentioned here a few times, that they stop non-viable efforts before making major investments, and they can redirect those efforts or pause them as needed until conditions are more favorable. We found that as product development progresses and approaches production, iterations on the business case slow. And this is when user needs, product features, costs, and technologies are less likely to change. But there isn't necessarily a final business case. Companies often revisit the business case even for delivered products to decide whether to maintain or discontinue them, and use the existing business case as the basis for subsequent iterations. So as I close here, I want to recap with one point, a theme that you're seeing throughout these practices and what distinguishes them from traditional portfolio management practices is this agile iterative nature of continually reassessing market needs, how portfolios are positioned to address them, and how individual product development efforts are collectively contributing to the portfolio. And this is critical because it aligns with that technical process for iterative development that we're seeing more and more of. And then one more thing to note is that, as you might have observed here, this report focused on identifying leading commercial practices, but it didn't assess the department's practices against them. So we have ongoing work that applies the practices to the military services emerging policies for capability portfolio management and requirements development following the disestablishment of JSIDs. And we're planning to issue that work later this year, so you can look out for that. So that's actually all I have for my presentation. I'll give a little bit of time back, but I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Brenna. That was great. Those findings really make it clear that how you structure programs from the outset is every bit as important as the tools and policies that we put in place. And that brings us naturally to the question of strategic oversight. In particular, how the department manages and prioritizes its technology investments at the portfolio level. Brian Smith is going to take us through GAO's assessment of the Office of the Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering and what actions are needed to sharpen their oversight of technology development at the Department of War. Brian?
Thank you, Shelby. So I'm Brian Smith, as Shelby said, a senior analyst at GAO, and I'll be discussing the observations and findings from GAO 26-107664, which we issued in February of this year, a report titled Defense Research and Engineering, Action Needed to Improve Management and Oversight of Technology Investments. Next slide, please. So just to give a little bit of background on the report and how we got to this point, the House report accompanying the NDAA for FY26 included a provision for GAO to review how R&E is managing, overseeing, and improving DoD's innovation investments and outcomes. The provision was included in response to concern, which I think we would all agree remains a concern, by the House and Senate Armed Services Committees that technology development and technology transition just aren't occurring at the rate necessary to keep pace with near-peer adversaries such as China and Russia, as well as concern that R&E may not be best positioned with the proper responsibilities, roles, and authorities to oversee those technology development efforts. And the provision included language for GAO to recommend any policy and statutory changes that were needed to better position R&E to manage, oversee, and improve those investments and outcomes. Next slide. So as everyone is aware, the enterprise, the S&T R&E enterprise within DoD is pretty big. Just some numbers to illustrate how large. So in the President's budget for 26, DoD requested nearly $180 billion, and they will receive nearly $183 billion for RDT&E activities. This includes more than $24 billion for science and technology activities, BAs 1 through 3, and almost $42 billion for advanced component development and prototyping efforts, BA 4. Included in the amount is more than $2 billion in BA 1 through 3 activities and almost $10 billion in BA 4 funding that was part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Next slide, please. So as everyone is aware, R&E was created by the NDAA in fiscal year 2017 by the dissolution of the then Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, which then separated ATL into 2 separate offices, ANS and R&E. R&E's initial duties and responsibilities were then identified in that NDAA and then further clarified and with additional roles and responsibilities provided in the fiscal year 2020 NDAA. Subsequent NDAAs since 2019 have also affected R&E's roles and responsibilities. And then DoD Directive 513702, issued in 2020, details many of R&E's authorities and specifies dozens of key functions and responsibilities and defines the authorities of the office. Three legislative provisions that affect R&E and their roles and responsibilities since 2019. The NDAA for fiscal year 2021, for example, requires R&E to identify critical technology areas and to designate a senior official to coordinate research and engineering activities in that area. The following year, in 2022, the NDAA required that the Secretary of Defense develop an S&T strategy and to update that strategy following an issuance of the National Defense Strategy, as well as required the Secretary of Defense to establish the Accelerate the Procurement and Funding of Innovative Technologies Program, or APFIT. Now, both of those provisions, while directed at the Secretary of Defense, were subsequently delegated down to the Office of the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering. And then finally, Section 903 that year designated R&E as the Chief Technical Advisor to the JROC and required a study to determine if a further enhancement was required or necessary for R&E on the JROC. Next slide, please. So in our report, we really identified 3 primary challenges with R&E's ability to manage and oversee military department technology efforts. The first, that R&E's critical technology area roadmaps really lack consistent information to guide military departments' technology investments. We found that R&E has yet to ensure critical technology area roadmaps consistently provided sufficient information for military departments to invest in technologies for the joint fight, because R&E just had not developed formal guidance for those roadmaps. As I previously noted, R&E is responsible for identifying those critical technology areas and designating officials to develop the roadmaps. However, despite a statutory requirement to develop the roadmaps, there's no statutory requirements for the content of the roadmaps. And as such, the information varied by critical technology area. So roadmaps really serve as a tool both to communicate investment priorities to the military departments, as well as to assess whether the proposed budgets of the military departments will support those priorities. By not issuing guidance for roadmap development, however, R&E lacks reasonable assurances that the military departments are focusing on and investing in technologies that are considered critical to meeting both the NDS as well as maintaining technological superiority against our adversaries. The second challenge that we identified was the lack of statutory authority by R&E to provide input on military departments' investments. R&E is really limited in its ability to influence military department RDT&E budgets to ensure that they align with department-wide priorities, because it doesn't have the statutory authority to review and provide meaningful input to those budgets. Despite participation in the Deputies Management Action Group review of RDT&E budgets of the military departments, officials told us that they just don't receive detailed and timely budget documentation, in large part because the military departments aren't required to provide that information. Now, Congress has recognized the need for certain DoD organizations to have a greater role in reviewing military department budget submissions, such as the test and evaluation budgets. Now, Congress has granted budget certification authority to the Test Resource Management Center to enable it to have sufficient authority to review and assess military department budget submissions. Now, without going into the nitty-gritty details, the nuts and bolts of budget certification authority really is that it enables a DoD organization to certify that a military department's proposed budget is adequate, provide that certification to an appropriate official such as the Secretary of Defense, and that if the budget is not found to be adequate, then the military departments or the Secretary of Defense must report to Congress on what actions they will take to address those concerns. But it doesn't give TRMC in this example any type of veto authority over the budget themselves. So budget certification in this case would enable R&E to certify that the military department's RDT&E budgets are adequate. And then finally, the third challenge that we identified was just that military department's science and technology strategies don't fully align with the National Defense S&T strategy that's issued by R&E. The National Defense S&T strategy is required by statute to be updated, as I said earlier, following issuance of the NDS. However, there's no subsequent requirement in policy or statute for the military departments to update their department level strategies, nor is there a requirement that those department level strategies align with the National Defense S&T strategy. So that we found that the extent to which the military department's S&T strategies aligned with DoD's overarching strategy really varied by military department. Next slide, please. These challenges then subsequently have a lot of impact on technology investments across the department, as well as R&E's ability to provide oversight and management of those technology investments. So for example, on the lack of information in and guidance for the roadmaps, this impact really is that R&E risks having incomplete information about the technology development efforts that are being pursued by the military departments themselves, as well as by not identifying the content that the roadmap should contain, R&E risks that those roadmaps are not being used by decision makers to ensure that the military department's efforts align with R&E priorities. Without directing the level of investment needed in each CTA, R&E also lacks reasonable assurance that sufficient investments are being made towards progress in any given CTA to ensure timely delivery of future capabilities. The impact on technology investments because of the lack of statutory authority is just that R&E, because they, without having that proper authority and time to review and assess RDT&E budget submissions, DoD is risking that the military departments aren't investing in the technologies that are needed both for the current and future fight. DoD is also taking a risk that R&E, by not having a complete understanding of the full breadth of technology efforts that are being undertaken by the military departments, which would enable R&E to provide both effective management and oversight of these efforts, and then provide Congress with that information. Next slide, please. And then finally, this impact as a result of the lack of alignment with S&T strategies is really that without a requirement for the military departments to update and align their S&T strategies to the National Defense S&T strategy, there's just this risk that the military departments are pursuing technology development efforts that just don't match R&E's visions for technology development across DoD, which it has been given the responsibility to do, to provide that vision. And so the military departments are also risking pursuing technologies that also just don't match the objectives of the NDS, which is, required to be issued on a regular cadence, whereas there is, like I said, there's no requirement for the military departments to update their strategies on any type of regular cadence. Next slide, please. So in our report, we had 3 recommendations, as well as one for the department, as well as one recommendation or matter for congressional consideration. That matter is that Congress should consider providing R&E with that budget certification authority that I described earlier for RDT&E activities. And then for the recommendations to the department, recommendation 1 is just that the military departments should each develop and issue an S&T strategy that aligns with the National Defense S&T strategy to the maximum extent practicable, and then to update their strategies as needed to ensure continued alignment. R&E should issue guidance for the development of the CTA roadmaps. This guidance would identify stakeholders, including, from the military departments, to involve in the roadmaps, as well as identify the content that would need to be included in the roadmaps. And then finally, our last recommendation is just that R&E should provide annual guidance to the military departments on the amount of military department investment that R&E considers necessary to ensure alignment to the maximum extent practicable with each CTA roadmap. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I'll give a couple minutes back to folks and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate your time and your presentation. So now we're going to turn to Chris to talk about the test and evaluation enterprise, which has frankly too often been treated as the bottleneck at the back end of a program. But our research really suggests that it could be a proactive catalyst for speed, an engine of learning that accelerates delivery rather than gates it. So I want you to welcome Chris Durbin to talk about his report on the transformation of DoD's test and evaluation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Oakley. I'm Chris Durbin. I'm an assistant director in our contracting and national security acquisitions team at GAO, like my colleagues. I congratulate everyone for making it to the last presentation of the last panel of the last day of the conference. I think there's some hidden punishment here because usually I'm skipping out on this panel as a conferee, but as a presenter, I think what goes around comes around, I guess. But I appreciate you sticking around. I'm going to be presenting, as Ms. Oakley mentioned, on a report we issued this past December on weapons systems testing. And I want to thank my colleagues Ashley Rawson and John Armstrong, Catherine Long, Pete Anderson, and Lori Fields, among others, for their hard work in producing this report. And the report itself was in response to a provision included in a National Defense Authorization Act report, which called for GAO to assess how DoD is modernizing weapon system test and evaluation to improve the overall performance of defense acquisition programs. And as Ms. Oakley stated earlier, the primary measure of performance these days is speed, specifically ensuring that our warfighters get the relevant capabilities that they need when they need them to prosecute potential threats. And this was really interesting work with findings and recommendations that sparked a lot of internal debate and discussion within DoD's test and evaluation enterprise, which I'll get into more later. But hopefully you'll find this presentation as thought-provoking as DoD found our report. And if so, I encourage you to go to the GAO website and read the full report. Next slide, please. So we organize our work around 2 research objectives. The first sought to really identify and synthesize the different plans at DoD, meaning at both the OSD and the military department levels, has established to guide its modernization of the test and evaluation function. And then secondly, we look to see, are current test and evaluation policies conducive for enabling the modernization that DoD seeks? And to answer that second question, we relied on testing specific leading practices that we developed as part of a broader body of work that my colleague, Ms. Derritt, described earlier. And I think it's important to understand why these leading practices are so applicable. Namely, the leading companies that use them have consistently achieved the same thing that DoD itself now strives to achieve. And what that is delivering to users innovative capabilities that are both relevant and responsive to those users' needs, which evolve constantly. And leading product development companies have really cracked the code on how to do that. And the ones that haven't are the ones that lose market share and risk going out of business. So as part of the presentation, I'll be getting into the opportunities that we believe DoD has to start applying these leading practices within test and evaluation. Next slide, please. So you'll recognize this figure from my colleague Ms. Derritt's earlier presentation with just one change, and that's the light blue shaded area entitled Iterative Testing. And right there is the heart of how leading product development companies structure their test and evaluation of new products. You'll see it's not a distinct developmental testing phase, followed by a distinct operational testing phase, organized on a linear timeline with perhaps some of that DT and OT being performed in tandem. Rather, it's integrated, iterative testing from the time you have something to test that involves users and relies on their feedback to guide the product development. Importantly, this iterative testing is used to help product developers determine the art of the possible as to the product's design and eventual capabilities. Unlike traditional defense acquisition programs, leading companies do not lock in detailed requirements for the product at development start. Rather, they test and prototype and test again, relying on ongoing input and feedback from the end users of the product to understand which capabilities are most important to deliver soonest and which ones can await a future iteration of the product. In other words, unlike DoD, which traditionally has started development programs having already locked in those detailed performance and technical requirements, leading companies finish development and testing with the detailed product requirements. And those requirements take the form of a minimum viable product, as Ms. Derritt described, one that meets the priority needs of users and provides them value, and that can also be developed, produced, and delivered on a timeline responsive to those users' needs. Next slide, please. And from our work with leading product development companies from around the world over the past 6 years, we've distilled out these leading practices. This slide identifies 4 of them that are particularly relevant to test and evaluation and that we therefore applied in this work. I apologize if they're difficult to read, but essentially they translate several of the themes I've already discussed into terminology applicable to DoD test and evaluation. And they include such things as involving test officials early in defining the development program, giving them a formal voice in how they want to test, and providing them with access to the tools and data they need, including digital twins and digital threads, in order to test iteratively. Also, developing test plans that reflect iterative testing approaches, organized around development of minimum viable products. Also, ensuring that testers use the digital twins and digital threads, often acquired to aid the development process, but using those tools to test to the fullest extent possible. Again, remember that the role of iterative testing is not to catalog deficiencies. It's to provide information back to the product developers and users as to the capabilities and/or limitations of the system under test. And what this does is it helps developers and users determine whether or not the product or system qualifies as the minimum viable product that they want to go produce. If not, they'll keep adding, keep prototyping until they get something that provides that value added to the user that they're willing to spend money on within the time they're willing to allot. And then finally, developing and implementing end user agreements as components of test plans and strategies. These end user agreements should detail a process for obtaining ongoing, persistent user input throughout testing to ensure that the system under development and test is relevant and responsive to those users' most critical needs. Next slide, please. And so this slide gets into our first finding in that it summarizes content from the various plans DoD has developed to modernize test and evaluation. And we looked at lots of plans. There were 9 primary ones that we honed in on, including ones from the Defense Science Board, the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, and also ones from the Army, Navy, and Air Force test enterprises. And as you'd expect, specific findings and focus areas differed plan to plan, but they generally emphasized 3 primary avenues of modernization. The first being investment in test infrastructure, specifically focused on the digital tools I mentioned a minute ago. Another area was workforce transformation, rethinking how DoD trains, hires, and equips its testers with the skills and knowledge that they need to move quickly. And then finally, policy and guidance changes, reimagining how new technologies are tested and introduced, redefining the traditional testing function to accommodate the capabilities of digital engineering tools, and establishing expectations and means to test weapon systems earlier and more continuously. Next slide, please. So easy enough, right? Like, let's just give testers the resources, the authorities they need to go implement those modernizations, and we'll sit back and wait for the great results. Unfortunately, we found there are policies that really stand in the way of that. And building on what the modernization plans themselves found, we similarly found that DoD's current test and evaluation policies are ill-equipped in their current forms to position DoD to effectively modernize. Specifically, we found inconsistencies between each of the 4 leading practices that I described earlier and DoD-wide policies. Importantly, test policies applicable to the weapons programs where DoD spends the most money, those being major capability acquisitions and middle tier acquisitions, those are the ones where we found the largest gaps and inconsistencies with leading practices. Next slide. And this slide will be impossible probably for you to read, but the key takeaway here is all the empty circles. This table summarizes our review of Army, Navy, and Air Force testing policies. We reviewed those as supplementary to the DoD-wide policies. What that means is we looked at these policies to see if they filled any of the gaps resident in the DoD-wide policies. And as you can see from our Harvey Ball chart here, we found overall that they did not. Next slide, please. So what do we do? So we came up with 13 recommended actions for DoD to take to bring its testing policies into closer alignment with leading practices. And these recommendations organized around 3 primary themes: requiring developmental and operational tester input into acquisition strategies. Also, requiring iterative test plans and strategies enabled by digital twins and digital threads to support delivery of minimum viable products. And finally, requiring test plans and strategies incorporate end user agreements. And as I mentioned at the outset, DoD's response to our findings and recommendations was mixed. In large part, and despite our continued efforts throughout the engagement to convince certain parties otherwise, there were certain pockets of the DoD test and evaluation community that interpreted our findings as blaming everything that ails weapons system acquisition, blaming everything on the test and evaluation community. And that's not accurate at all. And that's not the message that we tried to put forward here, or if you read the words of the report, we did not put that message forward. We don't agree with that either. Rather, our prior work has shown test and evaluation is a crucial function that leading product development companies rely on to deliver innovative products with speed. We don't see DoD weapon system acquisition programs employing the DoD test community in that same way. Correspondingly, as you would expect, some of the test and evaluation community are not sold on the idea of evolving current structures in which they test a system, catalog its deficiencies, and write a report that helps warfighters understand, what the limitations and capabilities are of the delivered platform. And that's been a function that's been tremendously important over time, and kept our warfighters, safe and from getting deficient equipment. But as DoD moves forward and increasingly pivots toward iterative development approaches for new weapons, we think the test and evaluation community has to evolve too. Specifically, they have to take on a larger role in that new environment, a role that better positions them to help answer the call, that Secretary Hegseth has made, members of Congress and warfighters themselves. The call that DoD needs to develop capabilities faster and deliver them into the hands of the warfighters who need them. So, we'll be monitoring DoD's action on these recommendations over the next, year or two to come, and continuing to emphasize their importance. Next slide, please. But that concludes my presentation, and I appreciate you sticking around and look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. So I think what's clear from the presentations that everyone gave were that we covered the gamut of the acquisition cycle from soup to nuts, trying to look for opportunities to support the goals of speed and innovation and meeting our warfighters' needs more quickly. And so that's where the recommendations are aimed, and I'm just incredibly grateful to work with such awesome people that put out such great work in that vein. So let's get to questions. I'm going to go with Chris first. I got one question in the Q&A for you so far, and I would encourage everybody to send in your questions to the Q&A for the presenters. So the question is, Chris, how do you get around the fast horse user feedback that prohibits innovation?
I'm not familiar with the fast horse analogy. I am a fan of thoroughbred horse racing, Kentucky Derby, and all that. This is an analogy that escapes me. Do you have any additional context for what that means?
I don't have additional context. I'll let them respond with additional context while I move on to another question. How about that?
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, Brenna, we'll go to you.
Okay.
So DOW seems to really be saying a lot of the right things right now that seem to align with a lot of the things that GAO is saying in its acquisition transformation, a lot of the things that DOW is saying in its acquisition transformation strategy. I know that you obviously do the leading practices and understand kind of what underpins the need for change, but you also do our work on our annual weapons assessment as well too. And so I wanted to know what your take is on in practice and looking at the programs that you look at. Do you see real change in practice, and what do you see as the biggest holdup to real transformation within the department?
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. Yeah, we I think in some of the programs that we've assessed under the Quick Look, and this is an annual review we do every year, so we're always in the thick of it. We are seeing bits and pieces of things being implemented, and I think one of the bigger challenges is our program set up structurally to implement these things. So you can pull in the digital engineering tools. We didn't talk too much about that today, but digital twins that are the virtual representations of the physical systems, and digital threads that are, connecting all of the stakeholders and providing an original source of information throughout the life cycle. But if that is done on a linear scale across that linear product development process, it's just not as useful. You're not able to kind of make those real-time changes to the design and incorporate user feedback and refine capabilities to an MVP. So that's kind of where we see some of the major challenges, is bringing in parts of this in a way that just kind of limit the effectiveness. And I think in looking at the acquisition transformation strategy and a lot of the changes that are in the stages of being implemented, beginning to fill out those portfolios, I think that's where we'll be looking to see, are there substantive functional changes in how the department's managing its delivery of capabilities? So is it truly managing programs by capability areas and assessing how are those programs collectively meeting needs and prioritizing and allocating funds based on what is the most critical to need, and then deprioritizing programs that either aren't needed or maybe not positioned to deliver when they're needed? That's what we would want to see. Or is it something that's kind of moving program puzzle pieces around, right, under the portfolio acquisition executives, but still largely managing in that siloed program by program basis? So we'll see how that plays out, and hopefully we can see the better outcomes by all of these changes being implemented.
Okay, great. Chris, I got clarification, and it's actually an excellent question. The question really centers around, how do you kind of reconcile the just designing a faster horse when you might actually need a car, in terms of this kind of minimum viable product approach that we talk about.
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize for my confusion. That makes a lot of sense now. What we've thought about it as is more of like when did you make a decision to move away from a steam locomotive to go to an electric train? So, what drives that is user feedback, technology progression, and your available time and money. And at some point there will be a point where we don't need iPhone 48, right? There'll be something new that has come out of R&D that we can that Apple or whatever name your company can build a product around, right? That replaces the iPhone. But in the interim, you have iterations of the iPhone that continually improve and continually respond to users' needs. But there may be users' needs that you're hearing that platform can't accommodate. So you rack and stack those and put them, on the drawing board as an unfulfilled need. And you challenge your R&D community to come up with technologies that will be responsive to that. And once you have those mature technologies, you can hit the ground running with designing a product around those.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, speaking of R&D, Brian, I'm going to turn to you. One of the things that, you talked about was that where do you see kind of like this misalignment between the technology that DOW is investing in today and where the warfighter needs will be in 5 to 10 years? Does DOW even know what the balance of that incremental versus disruptive technology investment needs to be, or that the services need to be investing in? And how does that end up getting communicated to the services so that they align their investments to ensure that they're always looking for the next thing, the car instead of the faster horse?
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. We and Chris and I did this work almost 10 years ago, where we were looking at how leading commercial companies kind of do that segmentation between their incremental near-term technologies and their long-term, far-term disruptive technologies. And the big lesson that we take away from that work is that leading commercial companies are very deliberate in how they allocate their resources in those portfolios. And so, every company, it may be different. Some companies may choose to spend 30% on disruptive technologies and 70% on more near-term incremental. Other companies, may do 60%, 40%. But bottom line is they're very deliberate in how they do that. And then they assess, that portfolio and, make decisions on an annual basis of, do we need to reassess and rebalance, those investments? DoD isn't doing that. We have this recommendation out there that we encourage them to do that. We encourage them to assess that portfolio, but there has been a little bit of a roadblock in getting this recommendation through. I think part of the challenge from the department's point of view is, understandably so, the needs for each of the services are likely to be different. So what the Army needs to invest in on a near term, far term is likely different than what the Air Force or Navy need to invest in. And that's okay. We would encourage the department to set individual levels for each of the services. But, our message to the department is, make those assessments, set those target goals. I think the services recognize the need to do this. If you look at a lot of the strategic guidance and S&T strategies that the services put out, and even, at a high level at the R&E level, they are making the point of, we need to invest near term, we need to invest far term. Great. But I think the targets is what is kind of the missing piece on bringing that together. And what's interesting about that work and the work that we did, if you look at these challenges that we identified in that report that I presented today, and the impact on technology, I think at the base of that is setting those target goals, and then it rolls into, are those targets then expressed in the CTA roadmaps? Are the S&T strategies aligned for where you want to make investments? And then finally, does R&E have the appropriate and authority to really review those investments and make sure that investments are being made where R&E believes they need to be made?
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. I got a few more questions in the chat. Brenna, I'm going to turn to you on this one.
Okay.
So this is a question about MOSA, and I'm going to tweak it just a little bit, but there is a question about, how do you kind of retain an open system? How do you retain that MOSA approach when you're trying to go faster? And the second part of the thing was, especially when DOW doesn't own the platforms, and I assume that's meaning like when you're stuck with a sole source contractor or when you're going commercial, from that perspective. So if you want to share what you can, and I'm
Sure.
also happy to jump in as well too.
Yes. Yeah, no, that'd be great. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on MOSA, and be really interested in what my colleagues here think too. But yeah, I mean, we didn't talk too much about it in with regard to the portfolio management job, but back in that figure that you saw that Chris shared as well. Planning for production is actually something that should happen early on, right, in the design stage even, and so that the needs to accommodate modular open systems can be addressed as the system's being designed and even tested in those early digital simulations. So that should, MOSA should be a tool that aids, not a tool that gets in the way, right? It's similar to like digital engineering. The way leading companies are using these things is not, it's necessary because it helps them go faster by being able to plan earlier on and enable, the kinds of changes that could happen at the stage of production when you might need to change modular elements or think further ahead about subsequent iterations where maybe you want to hold on to a lot of the same design and make tweaks. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer. Again, really interested to hear what Chris, Brian, and you think, Shelby.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick, and then I'm going to jump to the last question because we only have 1 minute left. And I got another good one. Just, with the MOSA, I think it really exemplifies the need for the early planning and understanding of what are those most important and critical elements that will either be need to be maintained, more significantly could be obsolete, or could be subject of innovation going forward. And that's where that early learning and understanding really comes into play during the early development of the acquisition strategy for MOSA. So I don't think like there's this panacea of like, let's go commercial and, it's going to solve all of our problems, because then we just kind of get in another box of being stuck with capabilities that we don't have the opportunity to be able to iterate on and update and upgrade. So Chris, I'm going to leave you with the last question. I'm sorry, I want to get one more question. It says, to the bits and pieces improvement wise, is the reality that that comprehensive acquisition strategy improvements requires bottom-up, expert-led rather than top-down intent delivered by non-acquisition professionals. It's great that leadership wants faster, more responsive tech to put in the hands of warfighters as fast as possible, but we all already wanted that. So can you talk a little bit about how like the broader acquisition transformation strategy is real important, but what is also important is the bottom up.
Yeah, it's a great question. What I would say is you need leadership. You need leadership that empowers people to take chances, to take risks, and give that opportunity to fail fast. And acquisition professionals need to see examples of this in practice, to understand that the paradigm is changing, and there's going to be this pivot toward iterative development approaches to deliver capability faster. So there needs to be training that is organized around these topics. So I guess that's where I leave it is you need a leadership commitment that is not just words one day and gone the next. It needs to be a sustained commitment that is backed up by investment in training for our acquisition professionals, and then empowerment to those professionals to go out and try things and learn. And that's going to be that's different from the current culture, right? But if the priority is delivering innovative capability faster, the current paradigm has to change, and new approaches have to be tried.
Yeah, and I would just add, because it gets to the second part of this individual's question about, do we have the people, the talent at the lower levels to be able to kind of take these approaches, and are they incentivized to do things differently? And I think we haven't done that work yet, but we do, yesterday listening to the panel on workforce and some of the reductions and the categories of people that we're losing in terms of experience and opportunity to be able to train folks for the future, I think does present a significant challenge to the acquisition transformation strategy. And so I think it's something to definitely keep an eye on, because most people without, backing and leadership and experience default to kind of what they've already done, or just look to a checklist. And that's not going to suffice in this world of iterative development. Brian, quick one for you. I didn't realize, I forgot we had till 4. I don't know why I thought we were over at 3:45. So I was trying to cut us off of this great conversation. And I love all the questions that are coming in. Thank you all so much for engaging. Brian, do the services even determine their R&D budgets, or is that Congress, is the question?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I would say that it's the services that through the president's budget submission are offering, what they want to request on an annual basis. Obviously, there is a role for Congress to play in determining, what those ultimate final amounts, are, and through the appropriations process. I don't want to speak for Congress in any way, and saying that they're going to go higher or above, higher or lower than what the services are asking for, requesting. But I think ultimately, probably the best way of putting it, there's obviously a role for the legislative branch to play in that process. But I think ultimately it also does start within the Pentagon in determining, that having those conversations between the services saying this is what we need for R&D, as well as R&E saying this is where we want you to make these investments. So whether I think that also comes back to the previous question and about the minimum investment targets, right? So whether the Army is being given $1 or $1 billion, whatever the range is, the more important thing is, how are you allocating that investment? Are you, putting, and are you putting 40% in near term and 60% in far term, or vice versa? And I just really think that's kind of a missing piece in the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another question that I'm going to take a stab at first and then open it all up to you all, because ships are mentioned, and you all know that's one of my favorite topics. So it says, I've seen a lot of end result of challenges and shortcomings of our acquisition process. The primary problems at the user level, in my opinion, are the timeline for acquisition, particularly ship construction, are so long that by the time the ship is in service, they are already significantly behind, technologically speaking, and we seem to shy away from holding suppliers accountable when they fail to meet requirements. Do you think reformations in the discussion would address either or both of these issues? If not, what changes would you make to improve them? So this question actually exemplifies the need for like wholesale change across the process. When you have a defense industrial base that is comprised of very few prime contractors that supply the majority of our major weapon systems, it becomes this very difficult process of holding them accountable, because you need them to be able to do the things that you need them to do. So when you think about shipbuilders, for example, there's only very few that exist, and they all are pretty specialized in the types of ships that they build. So holding them accountable becomes increasingly difficult, because you can't walk away at that point. And so I'm going to turn to Chris and have him finish the answer in terms of why this new iterative development process can help in that regard. And then I also am going to let you know that we are going to have a report coming out in the summer related to shipbuilding and this notion of accountability for outcomes. So stay tuned for that. Chris?
Thank you. As you mentioned, this is not a primary area of my research, but I think it's important to remember, as Ms. Derritt talked about in her presentation, the nature of capabilities that the DoW seeks to acquire has changed from what it was 25 years ago. Going away are the hardware intensive platforms, that get driven hard, updated, modernized maybe once over their service life, big overhaul, and then scrapped eventually. Capabilities, including Navy ships, are increasingly software defined and hardware enabled. The muscle in a DDG-51 destroyer or a Ford class aircraft carrier is in the electronics and the software systems, whether on the aircraft themselves, on the carrier or resident, within the ship itself, the radars, all these are things where software underpins the capability. And software defined capabilities go hand in hand with iterative development. I mean, like I mentioned, or tried to mention, we see leading companies use iterative development across their product ranges, right? But it has its roots in software development, right? Back in the world where we developed software in parallel with hardware and then tried to match them up at some point along the journey. Now hardware and software are tested and developed together, overlapping one another through the digital engineering tools we've talked about. So I guess long story short, think about the capabilities that are on ships now. Yes, they remain an industrial type of pursuit as far as the nuts and bolts of the construction. But once you get through that and look at the lifespan of these ships, what you're going to be cleaning tanks, and you're going to be refurbing all kinds of stuff. But your warfighting capabilities are in those systems that affix themselves to the ship. And are software defined. Over.
Thank
Shelby?
you, Chris. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add on just from the kind of business process side of things? I mean, this is something that if capability portfolio management is truly implemented, according to the way what we see in the leading practices, some of these issues should be headed off long before so much money is spent, and there should be that ability to see, well, what are some of the capabilities that are progressing, even maybe in other portfolios, but at least in this capability area that we could leverage if we're seeing others lag, right, fall behind. What are ways to capitalize and leverage what's already being done, even if it's not the perfect solution, to make sure that capabilities are actually delivered much earlier, and that things that are not being successful are not going to kind of continue on a lifeline unnecessarily. So.
Yeah, and if I can, I would just add on real quick, to all of this is the very beginning of this is that technology development, and it's ensuring that there's a suite of technologies that are ready and available to be inserted, in the next iteration of the system. So, if we think back to, the slide that you showed, Brenna, at the beginning of your presentation on those iterative circles, what isn't shown in that is that on the far right or the far left side is, is basically a box of technologies that, even going further left, an engineer or researcher, they developed, had in that box, so that as that cycle began again, there was a technology insertion point and that technology was ready. And I think that's where we also see, how R&E and how the R&E enterprise really can play a role in this, is identify the technologies you need, have a vision for where you want to make those investments, ensure that sufficient investment is being made, and you're doing that so that you're not losing sight of the road, what's down the road 5, 10, 15 years, because as that, whatever aircraft carrier or ship or plane, or whatever it is, when it's ready for that next iteration, those technologies are ready to be inserted.
Good point, Brian. Brenna, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the warfighter and warfighter engagement throughout the acquisition process. The person was asking the question about Chris's, recommendation about the testers being included early on in the process, but this person wants to hear a little bit more about closing the link between the warfighter and the acquisition process. Can you talk a little bit about what our leading practices show about that critical importance of that early user engagement?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to boil it up to kind of one theme of describing this approach is that it's user-centered, kind of in all ways, starting from, if you're thinking about the portfolio level, it's in a bigger scale, but like what are those big capabilities that we're going to want to provide in the longer term? And when it comes to the individual product, the user is the starting point for building that business case. What is it that we're going to deliver to meet those needs? So you need to know what those needs are pretty clearly, and have that identified up front, and then have their input throughout both that technical development process of getting their input in the design and modeling stage, and then making sure that you're incorporating that into the business case, so that you can, verify, yep, this is still the kind of thing that we should be pursuing, or wait, there's another program in this portfolio that's actually going to meet these needs sooner or better. And so if you keep the user at the center, as that guidepost, then you have a much better chance of delivering something that's actually going to be valuable.
That's great, Brenna. We have 1 minute left, and there was a question that I didn't quite get to, but they were talking about kind of how do we develop manufacturing bases. Chris, I don't know, do you want to give a preview of your ongoing work in that regard?
Yeah, great question, and one that we'll be interested to know the answer to as well. As you just mentioned, we have ongoing work looking specifically at the issue of leading practices for manufacturing and supply chain management. If you think back to that 3-circle figure that Ms. Derritt and I both showed in our presentations, channeling toward that 3rd circle in the sequence, and really understanding it in greater detail than we've had opportunity to explore thus far. What makes that circle go round? and how do you take your produced product and learn from it to drive your subsequent iterations, whether that be an improvement to the already delivered product or a new product entirely. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll be back here to present on that sometime.
Awesome. Well, our time is up today. Brenna, Brian, and Chris, I really appreciate your responses and your candid answers. And, I just really makes me proud to hear you represent the body of work that we've done, and appreciate your participation. And so what I really want to leave you with is where I see the most important thing to focus on now is implementation. Everybody's using the right words. Everybody's talking about the same things as being important. Now the hard work and the more important work is on implementation. So I leave you with that challenge, whether you're a manager or a researcher or a policymaker or a future acquisition leader, you play a significant role in being able to drive these iterative, agile, data-driven, user-centered decisions within the Department of Defense and Department of War and how it acquires weapon systems. So thank you all today, and thank you, NPS, for giving us this time to present. Have a good evening.
Thank you.